This is a Fox News alert. A federal appeals court has ruled against President Donald Trump, and he is not happy about it. You will hear the president's reaction to the decision, the Ninth Circuit rejection of his travel ban. Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson tonight. In just a couple of minutes, Washington, D.C.'s Attorney General will be here to explain why he is fighting the president's ban. Charles Krauthammer will also respond to that. Also tonight, the head of a human rights organization defends his group's claim that President Trump is a top global threat to human rights, and he'll explain why. But first, Fox News correspondent Trace Gallagher on what has happened today in the news with the Ninth Circuit. Trace?
Tucker, the government's key argument was that Washington state didn't have the authority to challenge this because the president has unreviewable authority to suspend the admission of any class of aliens. The court ruled that when it comes to immigration and national security, quote, neither the Supreme Court nor our court has ever held that courts lack the authority to review executive action in those arenas for compliance with the Constitution. President Trump tweeted, quote, see you in court. The security of our nation is at stake. And here's what the president said. Listen close.
It's a political decision, and we're going to see them in court, and I look forward to doing it.
So you believe the judges made a political decision?
We have a situation where the security of our country is at stake. And it's a very, very serious situation. So we look forward, as I just said, to seeing them in court.
So
okay?
Do you think this has undercut the early days of your presidency? This is such a core issue.
This is just a decision that came down, but we're going to win the case.
And have you conferred with your new Attorney General on this tonight? Is he a part of it now?
No, I haven't. We just heard the decision.
How did you find out about the decision, Mr. President?
Just saw it. We just saw it just like you did.
Via the news, et cetera, the media.
But it's a decision that we'll win, in my opinion, very easily.
And are you
And by the way, we won that decision in Boston.
So the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, and the new Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, are about to hold a conference call on the next steps, deciding whether to file an emergency request with the Supreme Court or take this back to the district court in Seattle. Going back to district court could tie up this executive order for months. But the Supreme Court doesn't have a tiebreaker. And if the 8 current justices voted 4-4, the Ninth Circuit Court decision would stand. Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton says, quote, President Trump's order to temporarily pause the refugee program and travel from 7 war-torn countries is plainly legal under the Constitution. And Washington State's Governor Jay Inslee responded to the president by tweeting, we just saw you in court and we beat you. Tucker.
Trace Gallagher, thanks a lot for that. Well, one of the people providing the legal opposition to President Trump's executive order is Karl Racine. He's the Attorney General for the District of Columbia. He's one of 16 attorneys general who signed an amicus brief supporting the lawsuit against the president's orders. He joins us now from Washington. Mr. Attorney General, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Tucker.
In the ruling tonight, there was this line, and I'm puzzled by it. It says this: the government has not shown that the executive order provides what due process requires. Now, this order applies mostly to foreigners, non-U.S. citizens abroad. They're in other countries. The question, I think the key legal question here is, does due process as afforded by the Constitution apply to them? And if it does, it has massive implications for a lot of things. How could we ever bomb people in foreign countries, declare war on them, drone them, without giving them due process if they're due the rights the Constitution affords U.S. citizens? Does the court really mean to say that due process applies to foreigners in other countries?
Well, I think the court's focus on due process was related to the impact of this executive order on immigration law. And clearly, with respect to due process applies to citizens in the United States, residents in the United States, as well as individuals who have applied and been granted visas. The court was very clear on that.
So people in foreign countries who are not U.S. citizens, they're not on U.S. soil, but the constitutional protections that we enjoy as citizens apply to them. So would they have standing under the standard you've just articulated to file suit against the U.S. government on the grounds that say, I don't know, we bombed their country? So Iraqis with visas in hand, because our protections apply to them, why wouldn't they be able to sue in federal court in the U.S. for, I don't know, waging war against them?
Sure, Tucker, your hypothetical is interesting. I think it is a world away from the instant executive order related to immigration. The executive order related to immigration and the judge's ruling on due process made it clear that with respect to any person in the United States, citizens, residents, or folks who have been issued visas, whether they be in the States or not in the States, they are required under the law to be protected by due process, notice, and an opportunity to be heard.
So there's nothing theoretical, but I beg your pardon, about the example I just gave. I mean, if they have due process rights, the same ones you and I as U.S. citizens possess, those rights do not just apply to the president's executive orders or to immigration. They apply to the whole panoply of rights granted us by the Constitution. That's a big deal. That means that tens of thousands, potentially millions of people around the world, not allowed to vote here, do not live here, have standing in U.S. courts as citizens. Like, why is that not a huge thing?
Well, Tucker, it's because your hypothetical is so expansive and goes so far beyond the court's narrow application of the question presented that it's simply inapplicable. Why don't we focus on the case and the contesting of the executive order?
That's it. And I'm not a lawyer, so I'm just asking you a sincere question. So due process under the Constitution only applies to visas and immigration when those rights are curtailed by an executive order by the president.
That's what the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals said.
Okay, so explain to me, if you would, in simple terms, what's legally wrong with the president's executive orders? Why are they against the Constitution, or what's the statutory problem with them?
Sure. There's several significant infirmities that the Ninth Circuit found. Number one, the government took the position that the executive order was unreviewable. The Ninth Circuit, citing cases going back to 50 years ago, made it clear that while a president's executive order that impacts national security and immigration is entitled to deference, it is reviewable under constitutional standards. That's point number one. Second point, standing. The court made clear that states have standing to bring actions against the federal government where the federal government's actions will impact the states. And the states of Washington and Minnesota presented compelling evidence of the impact on students at universities, professors at universities, employees, and businesses.
Okay, and that all seems reasonable, but I'm asking, what's the core legal or constitutional problem with the orders in the first place? Why do they contravene the Constitution or existing immigration law? I'm confused about that.
Okay, well, let me try to clear it up for you. What the court also found is that the rationale behind the executive order was not well established, in fact, by the government. The court pointed out and highlighted that in none of the 7 countries at issue did the government present any evidence of any terrorist strike from those countries at to the United States. Under the court's review, under the Constitution, the government needed to provide that evidence and wholly failed to. That's another very important fact here.
Okay, so your position, because you signed on to this in the amicus brief, is that there is no threat from refugees or immigrants from, say, Somalia, even though there have been a couple of pretty recent cases where refugees from that specific country or their children have committed terror attacks or been arrested in terror plots. That's not real. There's no actual threat. It's made up. Is that the position?
No, my position is, and I heard the oral argument, which was an extraordinary teaching lesson in the Constitution, and the judges asked the government lawyer to provide it of evidence of any terrorist act from those 7 countries. And as the opinion makes clear, the government provided no evidence.
I noticed that. That's exactly right. And that may have been a failure of preparation or a failure of sophistication. I mean, they clearly didn't do a good job defending their position. But I want to get back to what the core problem is. Now, you're hearing people argue that the problem with these executive orders is they specify, though indirectly, a religion. It set up a religious test for our immigration policy. And that may or may not be true, but I'm struck by that argument because, of course, we have had explicit religious tests for our immigration policy pretty recently. Up until 1988, September of '88, the U.S. government automatically granted refugee status to Soviet Jews because they were victims of persecution. And, by the way, they were. And so we automatically gave them refugee status because of their religion. Was that a bad thing to do?
Well, you know, I haven't really thought about that example, and I certainly don't think it was a bad thing to do because, as you know, the Soviet Jews were being persecuted.
Big time. Right. So why would it be a bad thing to carve out special status for Middle Eastern Christians who are the subject of genocide, and they are. No one disputes that. What's the difference?
Well, this order did not do that, as you know. What this order did, and what the court found, was that there was evidence not only in the order but outside the order. Statements by the President of the United States, statements by his aides, that the order, in fact, was discriminatory to a certain religion and therefore elevated religion in a way that is counter to the Establishment Clause of the Constitution.
Right, but as I just said, of course, we've done this before and no one said anything. There is a precedent for singling out people on the basis of their religion for special treatment in our immigration law. And yet this is somehow different, and you haven't explained why. And the other example that people bring up is that somehow this is wrong to specify or bar people by country of origin, and yet, of course, our immigration policy, by definition, categorizes people by country of origin. The 65 Immigration Act is all about country of origin. We're going to take this many from this country and this many from this region. And that, of course, has not been found to be unconstitutional. So why is this unconstitutional?
Well, the 65 Immigration and Nationality Act specifically indicates that while, of course, the government can make decisions on the number of individuals it admits from a country, it cannot discriminate wholly on the basis of national origin. That's been the law since 1965. It's not been contested. And again, if you read the Ninth Circuit opinion, you'll see that the Ninth Circuit, an ideologically diverse court, a very important point, unanimously ruled with the states and against the government's arguments, many of which that you're making tonight.
But wait, I mean, I understand the talking point, but that's just not true. I mean, the Immigration Act of 1990, which was like yesterday, basically, 27 years ago, created a diversity visa dedicated to channel immigrants from countries with low rates of immigration to the United States, which is to say it gave favor to some immigrants based on national origin and disfavored others based on national origin. This is our current law. So I don't understand why these executive orders are inconsistent with this precedent. And no one has explained that to me.
Well, and I've got to tell you, Tucker, I appreciate your creativity and certainly appreciate your hypotheticals. The Department of Justice...
That's not hypothetical, it's the law.
Let me just make the point. Your Department of Justice did not make any of the arguments that you made. The Ninth Circuit and the federal court before it evaluated the executive order under well-established principles of the Constitution, and at every instance in the Ninth Circuit, they found that the government's arguments were unavailing. That's the point.
Yeah, but it doesn't get to the core. I mean, for viewers at home wondering what's legal, what's not, what's constitutional, what's not, you've made the case that they made a bad case, and I agree with you, but you haven't explained what the constitutional principles are at stake, and I still don't understand them, unfortunately. And we're out of time, and I wish we had more time.
I look forward to
Carl,
talking
thanks
to
a
you
lot
again.
For joining us. Thanks, you.
Tucker.
Last week, the forces of tolerance rioted at UC Berkeley to keep Milo Yiannopoulos from giving his political views. Up next, we'll talk to a college Democrat, the leader of the college Democrats, actually, who says his fellow liberals have become regressive rather than progressive. Also, Human Rights Watch says a top risk to global human rights in 2017 is, you guessed it, President Trump. The group's head will tell us what sets the president apart from other autocrats like Kim Jong-un. Plus, Charles Krauthammer here with his thoughts on today's big ruling. That's all ahead. Stay tuned. Well, it's been a week since UC Berkeley literally went up in flames in response to an attempted speech by Milo Yiannopoulos. We spoke to Yiannopoulos immediately afterward, and he had this to say about what had just happened to him.
All sorts of things happened to people who just showed up, not all of whom were fans of mine, but just who wanted to come and just listen to what I had to say. You know, and those people were attacked, physically attacked, right? This is political violence in response to perfectly mainstream opinion.
Well, the aftermath in some quarters was pretty disheartening. Berkeley's campus paper published no fewer than 5 separate editorials defending the use of violence to stop Milo from saying things they disagreed with. One alternative voice to that, though, was Matt Teitelbaum. He's the president of the University of Maryland College Democrats, and he recently wrote a piece, quote, "I'm a liberal and I want Milo Yiannopoulos on my campus." He joins us now. Matt, thanks a lot for coming on. So,
Hi, Tucker.
in
Thank you
this
so much for having me
piece,
on.
well, it's glad to talk to you, and it's reassuring to talk to a liberal who believes in free speech. You say this, you lead it with, "My most cherished liberty is free speech." So first of all, God bless you for saying that. Second, why is that such an uncommon sentiment among your fellow liberals? It used to be commonplace. That was the line. You know, I'll die for your right to say something I disagree with. Why is that not heard anymore?
Yeah, well, you know, and that is the crux of my message, that although I really don't agree with the vast majority of what Milo says, really all I agree with him on is his right to speak, I will defend to the death his right to say it. And I will say, I think that with liberals, what's happened is a very small but very loud minority has started to really hurt the conversation and has tried to silence people. And all it's done is, look, it made Milo famous. It's just making this fight tougher for us. So, you know, I'm trying to awaken the silent majority of us that do believe in free speech, that are real liberals, not regressives, to fight back with our words.
Well, I guess I disagree with you on your point about it being a small minority. There's been a lot of polling on this, and the poll I saw yesterday showed that about half of self-described liberals on college campuses believe there are limits to free speech, and those end with what they call hate speech, defined as something I disagree with. How many college classes have you been in where the professor has made a point of reminding the class that free speech is your birthright as an American and that it's absolute?
Well, you know, I go to Towson University, which is an excellent school, where, you know, sometimes with students I can tell that there's a lot of sensitivity and that political correctness with certain students who, you know, have definitely been critical of my article since it came out, might trump the right to free speech. But I would say that overall on colleges, again, it's a small minority. Most of the professors I've had, they may not start every class with, you know, free speech is your birthright, but they do say, hey, let's have an open dialogue. Let's not be disrespectful to one another. If you disagree with somebody, engage them in a respectful way. And I'm really glad that I've had professors, great professors at Towson, who've done that. And I hope to think, and I'm confident, that it's most liberals and conservatives all across America that believe that. And I want to bring us together around that cause and you know, take the power away from this loud, oh so loud minority.
Yes, and violent, because it's not just that they disagree, it's that they're willing to use force to make certain people they disagree with are not heard. And by the way, without a common agreement on the freedom of speech, you can't have any kind of conversation at all. So what has been the response been to your piece as an avowed liberal, the head of the college Democrats defending free speech? What kind of response have you had?
Well, you know, I've gotten a lot of support because, as I said, you know, I think that it's a majority that hasn't been able to speak out as much because of the violence, as you said, of the minority. But I have gotten some, you know, some heat for it, and I'm accountable for my words publicly. You know, I'm ready to take the heat. And right now, I think it's important for liberals like me, like other people where I sort of, other liberals that I admire, like Bill Maher and Dave Rubin, who has popularized the term regressive left. It's important for us to, you know, wake up people like us and say, let's take back the Democratic Party. Let's take back the word liberal so that it doesn't mean regressive, so that it doesn't mean anti-free speech, so that it means, you know, we have our positions. We'll debate you on yours. We're not going to try to silence you.
So you mentioned Dave Rubin. I don't know who he is. I know who Bill Maher is. Those are two people, and good for them, who are standing up for free speech. But what about the actual leaders of the American left? It's political leaders. I didn't hear any of them, not one of them, say, hey, Milo Yiannopoulos ought to have a right to say what he thinks. Like, this is America. Why did nobody say that?
Well, you know, I did, and I'm the president of the College Democrats of Maryland, and I hope that people will follow suit. I hope that maybe people will be watching tonight, and they'll go, you know what, I agree with him. I agree. I'm a Democrat. I'm a liberal. I think people read my article that agree with me. I've heard from people who read my article that agree with me, my op-ed, that is. And I'm very, very hopeful that maybe I'm starting a conversation amongst liberals, along with people like Bill Maher and others, where we say this is not okay. That liberalism means supporting free speech. I really do think there's potential here to nip in the bud this PR problem that liberals have, where everyone thinks we're snowflakes, we're politically correct, you know, the millennials, whatever. I'm trying to start a conversation here about that because it is important.
Yeah, it's vital, and it's more than a PR problem. Godspeed. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Tucker. Thank you so much for having me on.
Ever feel confused by the new age lingo campus activists throw around? Well, now you don't have an excuse, because the words microaggression and safe space are not just activist newspeak. This week, both were added to the latest edition of Merriam-Webster's dictionary. They are official. For example, the dictionary defines, quote, a safe space as a place intended to be free of bias, conflict, criticism, or potentially threatening actions, ideas, or conversations. Sadly, they don't mention them being free of the First Amendment as well, which, of course, by definition, they are. Webster says those and 1,000 other newly added words are intended to reflect the, quote, continuing record of our evolving language, and they do. Well, according to Human Rights Watch, President Trump is, quote, a demagogue and the world should tremble at the threat he poses to human rights. The group's executive director will be here next to explain what that means. That's coming up next. Korea, Saudi Arabia, Zimbabwe, America. The group Human Rights Watch says the U.S. has become a global threat to human rights thanks to Donald Trump's election as president. The group says that because the president condemns illegal immigration, opposes abortion, and once criticized a disabled reporter from the New York Times, he embodies a threat to human rights worldwide. Well, we're joined now by Human Rights Watch Executive Director Kenneth Roth. Mr. Roth, thanks a lot for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me, Tucker. Why don't I begin with that introduction? Because, that wasn't really an honest explanation of what the book said. What you're quoting from is Human Rights Watch's annual World Report. It covers 90 countries around the world, including those that you mentioned there. We condemn, Egypt, the atrocities being committed by Putin, Assad's killing of people in Syria, Putin, Erdogan, a number of the friends of Trump. So in addition, we highlight what we talk about the global rise of populists. And it isn't, just Trump criticized a disabled journalist. It's that there are a group of people, Trump included, but also Marine Le Pen in France, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Jaroslaw Kaczynski in Poland, a series of people who are rising in Western countries. And what they have in common is that all of them claim a special insight into what the majority wants and claims that that majority desire, the will of the people, justifies their basically dumping on certain disfavored minorities. We saw that in the case of Trump with his xenophobia, his racism, his nativism, his misogyny, his Islamophobia.
I've heard the lecture.
Yeah, and so
basically, but hold on. But wait, stop. You just said I was dishonest in my characterization.
Yes, because in other words, you said that he said Trump is a threat to the world because he mocked a disabled journalist. Now, I think that was the wrong thing to do, but to say that that's because he's a threat to the world, honestly, we think he's a threat to, frankly, democracy in the United States, because I'm not sure that this is a man who actually respects the limits on executive power. But our big concern globally is that this is a man who I don't think wants to stand up for human rights around the world.
Okay, I understand your position, but I just want
for our viewers I'm just describing what the report said.
Right, your World Report 2017.
Exactly.
And I just want to, and look, by the way, I think that there are human rights abuses in lots of countries. I think the U.S. has committed human rights abuses, and I'm glad that there are people watching it. I'm not against monitoring human rights abuses. I'm for it.
And the U.S. is one of the 90 countries that Human Rights Watch covers, exactly, in that report.
What I'm bothered by is the distortion of scale and the obviously partisan motives you have, which I think belittle your mission. But I'm going to give you an example. So you devote, on the subject of Zimbabwe, which is an openly racist country committing ethnic cleansing against a minority in the country, as you know, you commit 1,398 words. Cuba, which keeps dissidents in prison, 1,742. North Korea, probably the worst country in the world, 1,609. Iran, 1,896. Saudi Arabia, 2,500. The United States, 3,782 words. So I guess my point is, if it's more than twice the space that you spend describing the human rights abuses in countries that define the term human rights abuses.
Tucker,
it's all out of whack.
Do you really think bean counting words is the measure of how severe somebody's human rights violations
are?
It's one
measure.
Don't you have to look at what the words say, Tucker?
Yes, and I did.
You accuse me of being partisan. Let's look, for example, I had an op-ed in the Washington Post 3-4 days before Trump's inauguration where I was highly critical of Obama for his failures of a counterterrorism policy in ways that I think make America much less safe. If you looked at that World Report over the prior 8 years, we would have been highly critical of Obama's human rights policies, as we were. So this is not about
you weren't actually,
partisanship.
and I read them every year, and
I know you didn't call me in for those cases.
You're not highly critical.
Yeah, you were probably happy that I was criticizing Obama. You didn't call me in then.
No, I was actually happy that you're one of the few people on the left who raised concerns about the drone program, which I think are legitimate.
I'm a principled human rights
proponent. For you. Well, actually, you are on the left, and it's obvious from what you write. And let me give you an example. This is Human Rights Watch. This is on your website. Human rights in danger. What is happening to human rights in the world? The United States, Donald Trump is the next president of the United States. He has said many things against human rights. I'm quoting you. He has said, for example, he blamed people who have come to the U.S. from other countries for problems with money and jobs. Well, some of those criticisms are legitimate and rooted in fact and economics. Then you said he made fun of someone with a disability. How is mocking someone or being rude a threat to human rights? I mean, I know you don't like it. I don't like it either. But it's not a threat to human rights. Like, what is that?
A president is supposed to uphold the rights of everybody, including the disabled. You don't want a president who, rather than protecting the disabled, mocks them. That's
but
not
he
about
wasn't
human
questioning
rights.
the rights of the no. Now this is when you're above this. He wasn't questioning the rights of the disabled. By the way, he was a candidate, not a president, when he did this. He was mocking a guy in a rude way. Now I wouldn't allow my children to act that way. I thought it was offensive. But he didn't question the rights of the disabled. He mocked a specific New York Times reporter.
No,
why are you conflating that with an attack on human rights?
Because he's an aspiring president, and the responsibility of the president is to respect the rights of everybody, including
mocking somebody is an attack on everybody who shares their characteristics? What are you saying?
It's illustrative of a president who is not terribly interested in defending the rights of the unpopular. That's our concern. And whether the unpopulars are the undocumented immigrants or refugees or blacks or women, over and over, you saw this disrespect for these people, which is not what you would want in the case of a president whose job it is to uphold everybody's
generalizations
rights.
Rather than, but you're not answering a specific question that I asked.
What's the
question? And you're going to the big picture. The big picture was, how was candidate Trump's rudeness to a disabled New York Times reporter illustrative, as you put it, of his feelings about the disabled generally? How is that undermining the rights of disabled people by mocking one New York Times reporter who's disabled? It's not, actually.
We all saw that little thing he did. It was mocking a disabled person. So that is not the kind of respect for the disabled that you look for in a president whose job, among other things,
how does that
is to
undermine their
protect
rights? I'm quoting you. How does that undermine their rights?
Let me explain. We'll go back to the report. What we highlighted in that report is that here is first a candidate, now a president, who claims this special insight into what the people want and has used that insight to trample on actual people and their rights. And obviously, these are early days in his presidency, so we're not saying this is necessarily where he's going, but we are worried. And that's the reason we wrote that report. And we are seeing this.
Look, you're not being. I think there are things to worry about, and I think you're the guy to bring those to our attention. But when you start claiming that making fun of a New York Times reporter is an attack on all disabled people, you undermine your credibility.
You're the one who said that. You're the one who said that. I said
it says right here.
No. I said that somebody who mocks the disabled or jokes about groping women or disparages black people as living in these hellholes in inner cities, or says that all Mexicans are criminals, or treats all Muslims or all Syrian refugees as would-be terrorists, that is not the respect for individual difference that I look for in a president whose job it is to protect the rights of us all, including the unpopular, including minorities.
Including the unpopular. But again, you haven't explained why a specific attack on one person. Look, what you're doing is engaging in a piece of political rhetoric rather than a sober critique of human rights.
Wait.
No, because you're committing
you keep coming back to politics. You didn't call me in the last 8 years when we were being highly critical of Obama, because I presume you like that. I'm not being partisan. I'm not being political. I'm trying to be principled here and hold every president to uphold the standards of human rights, including for the disfavored.
Let me summarize, almost from memory, your summary of President Obama. You said his one main failing was he didn't do enough to make good, to fix the human rights problems that the previous president left him, that he left the door open for the next president because he didn't ameliorate the human rights violations that President Bush left him. It was basically a partisan statement.
No, one of the questions I had was, for example, Obama never prosecuted anybody for torture. He never closed down Guantanamo. These were major failings on his part. He was not nearly as transparent in his use of drones as we wanted to do. We were highly critical of him in many respects. Now, our concern about... You go back and read our 8 years of reports. You'll see plenty of criticism. That's not the issue.
I have. I read them every year. Let me ask you one last question. I've always wanted to ask you this. Yeah. So the Constitution guarantees, and the courts have upheld this, the right of individuals to keep and bear arms. That is under attack by a lot of politicians in this country who are trying to take away people's right, law-abiding people's right, to exercise their Second Amendment guarantee. That is an attack on their human rights as defined by the Constitution, and I've never heard you stand up against that. Why?
Well, international human rights law, which is what we uphold, which is different from constitutional law, doesn't talk about the right to bear arms. In fact, it talks about the duty of a government to protect the safety of everyone. And if you compare, the epidemic of gun violence in this country with many other countries that have much tighter gun control laws and much greater public safety, you can make the opposite argument, Tucker. You can make the argument that the gun advocates are undermining human rights of Americans.
I know that you make that argument. The First Amendment, though, is a universal right, the right to express your political views. A week ago tonight, Milo Yiannopoulos was prevented from speaking by a violent mob. They wouldn't let him speak. His right to speak freely was abridged. I didn't see any press release from you guys on that, or the many attacks on the First Amendment we see from the left.
Yeah,
Why?
Because we focus on what governments do, not what individual people do. But obviously, the right includes the right of Milo to speak.
It's a state university.
Everybody has a right to speak, even if it's unpopular. I don't differ with you.
Well, I notice you don't. Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Up next, Edward Snowden is a hero to many, but could he simply be a top Russian intelligence asset who betrayed America? Our next guest says that's exactly what he was. He just wrote a book on it. He joins us. Well, it's been 3.5 years since Edward Snowden walked off to Russia with a vast trove of American secrets, more than 1 million pages of them. He's still a hero to many, and groups like the ACLU and Amnesty International have called upon President Obama to pardon him before leaving office. Obama didn't. Now, a new book aggressively questions the idea that Snowden was any kind of hero, saying that he deliberately sought to steal American secrets before accepting Putin's offer to defect to Russia. Edward J. Epstein has dedicated his life to investigating a lot of things, including journalism. And he just released his latest book, How America Lost Its Secrets, Snowden, the Man, and the Theft. And he joins us now. Edward J. Epstein, great to see you.
Nice seeing you, Tuck.
You point out in your book that in some ways Snowden did the American public a favor by proving that the U.S. government was in fact spying on the population and doing so secretly. But then you make the point that he went way beyond that and damaged American national security. Why didn't he stop at the public service part of what he did?
Well, I think one has to acknowledge that there's always a silver lining to every cloud. But the cloud was really a very dark thunderstorm in terms of what happened to American intelligence because of the damage purposely and deliberately inflicted by Snowden.
And it was purposeful and deliberate. You demonstrate, and you talked to him, you went over to Russia. What was his motive exactly?
I don't really know Snowden's motive. I'm more interested in his actions. Why he took these documents. There were 1.5 million files, according to the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, that he removed. Once he removed these files, they were compromised, and the entire communications intelligence of the West shrunk by that amount. So why did he do this? What he did is basically fly to Hong Kong. He made a pit stop there where he managed to make himself the poster boy of whistleblowing for American journalism. They never could see the whole story. They never asked what happened to the other 1,440,000 documents he didn't give journalists. Why did he go to Russia? The one thing I am sure of is that his going to Russia was done as a Russian-supported operation.
Yes, and you demonstrate that. He boarded an Aeroflot plane with an invalid passport, and that only could have happened with the complicity of the Russian government.
Not only that,
but what happened to the rest of the documents? You say only a small percentage made it into the hands of journalists. Where are the rest? Were all of them released?
Well, that's the trillion-dollar question, because in the murky world of espionage, we don't really know who gets which documents. We don't know if they went to Russia, China, if they were divided, if he threw them into the sea. But the damage was that basically the military, the Pentagon, had to spend 5 months going through 1,500,000 files. Every source, every method had to be canceled. It was a huge destructive exercise that happened, and we've suffered because of it.
So I didn't understand from what you wrote why the NSA would have given Snowden, who was not an employee but a contractor, access to what you described level 3 secrets, the highest level secrets. Why would they have let him handle those or have access to them?
Snowden somehow learned that another contractor, Booz Allen Hamilton, had a contract to work on level 3, which are secrets without sources and where the sources and methods aren't taken away. So he purposely switched jobs. He said that. He changed jobs to get at the lists of computers that were being penetrated by the NSA. So he went after. It wasn't, they didn't accidentally come before him. He targeted and went after the sources and methods, which are the crown jewels of any intelligence service and incredibly important to communications intelligence.
Yeah, more even than we may understand. Edward J. Epstein, thanks a lot for coming on tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Tucker.
Up next, we'll talk to Charles Krauthammer about today's ruling out of the Ninth Circuit Court and what it means for the Trump presidency and you. We'll be right back. So Fox News alert, a federal appeals court has upheld the block on President Trump's travel ban from 7 Muslim-majority countries. The past year and a half, of course, has given ample proof that the president is not deterred by a setback, even those that would have destroyed more timid politicians. It's no surprise, then, that he immediately vowed to fight on, ironically saying he would see the court in court. Has the president finally found a fight that he can't win, and where do we go from here? To tell us, we're joined by columnist and Fox News contributor, Dr. Charles Krauthammer. Charles, thanks a lot for joining us. So what exactly is the court saying here? I'm trying to understand what the central objection to the president's executive order is.
Look, I think this is a disgraceful conclusion because what they did is they substituted their judgment as to what constitutes a threat to American security for the president's. Now, we were all interested in what they think, but that is irrelevant to the case. The case was, does the president have the authority to do it? And if he does, it's his judgment to make. And that's the plain reading of the law. It's the plain understanding of the Constitution. I think the policy was unwise, but that's irrelevant.
Right.
I think it is very clearly legal. This is the most left-wing, most overturned court in the country. So I think for the administration, and considering that Trump does not like to lose, I think he may want to go to the Supreme Court, which may not be the most tactically wise way to go. But you know that he tweeted out, "See you in court." Well, I'm told that
yes.
the governor of Washington State just tweeted out, "We did go to court, and you lost." Now, that is sure to get a rise out of the president. And I suspect out of a matter of pride, he's going to want to go to the Supreme Court, where I think his chances may be dicey. So there's just no slam dunk, even though I think if we had a full court, if we had Scalia, or if we have the new justice, he would win. But we're not sure where it goes. Remember, as you know, Tucker, if the high court splits 4-4, then the ruling of the Ninth Circuit, the one we got tonight, stands, and the president loses.
Now, I've heard some speculation about the case that the Justice Department lawyers, the career attorneys from DOJ, made before the appeals court. And I've heard a number of people, attorneys, say it wasn't a very apt case. They didn't do a very good job, and they seemed a little light on detail. And at one point they were asked, well, name the threat. Be more specific about the threat that the U.S. may face from these 7 countries. And they didn't seem to have the facts with them. Do you think it's possible that they didn't make a very good case, and that they didn't make a good case because they don't believe in the case?
Well, on the first question, I was listening in to the oral arguments, and the Trump side, the federal government side, was, I thought, exceedingly weak. I don't think they were throwing the game. I don't think this is a guy who went in there deliberately to lose. I think this was a junior guy. I'm told the top 2 were unable to do it for whatever reason, had to recuse themselves. And remember, I think this is a mistake, a tactical error by the administration. You don't go into a decision like this, executive order like this, where you know you're going to get sued. You know you might get stayed, unprepared. They did it before having an attorney general in place, so they are dependent on the career people who are not necessarily the top of their class. I don't think this was a guy who was playing the 1919 White Sox, throwing the World Series. I think he just wasn't. He was a minor leaguer who was, had to bat in the World Series.
Charles Krauthammer, thanks a lot. Coming up next, CNN's Chris Cuomo had an unfortunate day when he tried to equate the term fake news with racism. Maybe the press shouldn't have used it so much 3 months ago. We'll show you that blunder right after the break. Well, just 3 months after the press force-memed fake news onto the American public, a member of the media has tried to equate it with, of course, racial slurs. Background: today, President Trump labeled Chris Cuomo of CNN a purveyor of fake news for not pressing Senator Richard Blumenthal aggressively on his claim that he served in Vietnam when he didn't. In response, Cuomo said this.
Fake news is the worst thing that you can call a journalist. It's like an ethnic disparagement. You know, we all have these ugly words for people. That's the one for journalists. And David, he just keeps doubling down when the facts don't favor his position.
You insulted me. I'm Rosa Parks. Well, the man who once claimed it was illegal to read WikiLeaks emails soon learned he'd made another mistake just a few hours later. Cuomo apologized, saying the pain of being called a phony was, quote, nothing compared to the pain of a racial slur.